Hello, everyone. Kenton Kivestu here from the RocketBlocks team. In this mock interview video, we're going to be sitting down with Darsh Thakkar, who is a product manager at Microsoft, focusing on the Microsoft Teams product. In this particular mock interview video, we're going to be doing a product estimation question, and specifically, Darsh is going to be working on estimating the number of new Google Docs created in any given day. So let's go ahead and jump in and see how Darsh approaches this.
So let's imagine that you are a product manager and you're working at Google. And for an upcoming project that you're going to be working on, one of the key things you need to do is estimate the number of Google Docs that are created on any given day. Now, this number exists internally and there are dashboards, but at the moment, you're in a different group. You don't have access to it. So you actually need to build an estimate from scratch. So, how would you go about doing that?
Sure, that makes sense. Um, so I think Google Doc is a pretty massive product with a lot of segment, lot of users, and overall there is a complexity here. Like there are Google Drive users, there are Gmail users, there are Internet users. So I guess before quite of digging into the problem, like
Yep.
one question I would have is, are we looking for any geographical bound for this problem for a particular geographical area or throughout the globe?
Yep, good question. So, for the purposes of this exercise, we can think about Google Docs created within the United States of America. So, the end user that's creating the doc is sort of within the boundaries of the United States.
Okay, got it. That's good to know. And I guess one more question I had was, when you think about Google Doc, it's part of G Suite,
Yep.
which has a different kind of users, like casual users. So, like
Mhm.
person like me who has a normal Gmail ID, or there might be like an enterprise user who is basically using Google Doc as part of their company, like Google employees, for
Yep.
example. So, are we concerned about any specific kind of users, or we just want to estimate an overall number?
Good question. So, I definitely agree about those two different segments. For the purposes of this exercise, let's focus on just getting to an overall number. But if you want to
Okay.
think about it in terms of a segmented way, that's totally fine by us.
Okay, that makes sense. I think at some point I would think about segments
Okay.
because their usage is different. And
Mm.
uh, thinking about just few thoughts here is like Google Doc is not something that is kind of like one-to-one matching. So what I mean is, if I use Google Docs, that doesn't mean I only open Google Doc once in a day, and it varies depending on your usage.
Yep.
So that is just a point that I had in mind. Um, so give me 5 seconds here to just think about the thought process and how I want to approach this problem.
Okay. Sure.
Okay. So I have a potential trail of thought, and this is something like I want to keep it like a conversation because there might be like a right answer, wrong answer, but I think it's just a good problem to kind of have thought out of. And if
Okay.
you feel like I might be going in a wrong direction, feel free to interrupt me.
Sure.
So this is what I'm going to do. I am going to take like a top-down approach. So I'm going to consider first of all like how many people are there in United States, and from then I want to derive on how many people use internet.
Okay.
From there, I would go to like not everybody who uses internet has an email ID. So out of that, how many email users are there? And out of that, how many Gmail users are there? Because there are definitely like people who don't use Gmail, or Gmail is not something exclusive.
Yep.
Like I have like 4 email IDs spread across. So that is something to consider. And then I'll think about how to kind of come to a Google Doc from a Gmail user. So first, I would try to estimate how many Gmail users are there in
Okay.
United States, and this is something that I think a Google search can also provide. But going from the mindset, first of all, I think the population of United States is around the number of 330 million.
Yep.
Correct me if I'm wrong. That's just an estimate that I'm aware of.
It sounds right to
Um,
me.
Out of that, now I want to think about how many people in United States have access to internet. So, considering the fact that United States is a developed country and internet is something widespreadly used in metro areas, rural areas as well these days. So, I think the it might be a good approximation to approximate a higher range rather than some other country.
Okay.
So, I think a good estimate would be around 85 to 80%.
Okay.
So I would go ahead with 85 for now.
Okay.
That 85% of people within United States have access to internet.
Got it.
So we previously made a fact that 330 million people we are assuming is the population of United States. So if
Hmm.
we do 85% of that, that approximately comes down to 280.5 million.
Okay.
So before I go ahead, just want to take a pause if like you are with me on this.
Yep, I'm following you so far.
Okay. So next up, I want to estimate out of these internet users, how many people even have an email ID. So again, since we are considering United States as a country, there are many people who use internet for their daily lives, and thus there are many people who would use an email ID. So again, taking an approximation, I don't think this would be 100% that every person who has access to internet has an email ID, but still it would be pretty close to 100%. So I would go with, let's say, 95% approximation, just for the fact.
Okay.
So that brings us to around 266.5, rounding off the number. So 266.5 million people within United States having an email ID. So the reason I'm focusing on email ID is because you can only access Google Drive if you have an email ID. You cannot access apart from that.
Okay.
So out of 266.5 million, I want to estimate how many people are Gmail users. Now, as I said, kind of like there is a segregation between enterprise users, casual users, and I might be working for a company which doesn't use Gmail, but my personal ID might be a Gmail ID.
Yeah.
So this is like a kind of critical path, which might be wrong, but I think a good estimation. I'm aware that Gmail is the leading email provider in United States. So I think Gmail, Outlook, and Yahoo are the three leading provider, and then there are others.
Yep.
But estimating like Gmail is the leading provider, and most people have a personal Gmail account, and plus their enterprise might be something else, but just focusing on personal Gmail account right now, I think more than almost 70 to 75% people who have an email ID would have a Gmail ID, even though they have some other email ID as well. That's my assumption. It
Okay.
can be wrong, but I just want to check in with you if you think this is a correct assumption to make.
I think it seems roughly right. I don't know the email market shares of the leading companies. I do think that Gmail is the biggest,
Yeah,
and I would guess they certainly have over 50% of the market for sure. So I think, and knowing your point about there's going to be some duplication, like many people will have Gmail and Yahoo and Outlook or some permutation there. I think that seems reasonable.
got it. So based on your point and my thought of trail before, I wouldn't go ahead and lock in 70%. As we mentioned, like for enterprise users, actually Gmail may not be that popular because a lot of companies are using like Microsoft these days, especially organization. So they use like Outlook, and a lot of students
Yep.
as well. So expecting like in the enterprise market and student like university market, the share of Gmail would be slight less than the consumer market. So I would consider that about 50 to 55%.
Okay.
And given this 50% and the 75%, which is enterprise and consumer, I think the best way to estimate without going like a very deep rooted calculus route would be just to take a simple average between those two.
Okay.
So taking an average between 55 and 70, that would be about 62.5. So for the sake of calculation, I would take it as 60%.
Okay.
So, and we previously create a paradigm that there are about 266.5 million people who have an email ID.
Okay.
So now I'll go ahead and I'll take 60% of 266.5 million.
Okay.
So that is around some ballpark range of 160 million, rounding off.
Okay.
Okay. So I want to take a pause here and I want to reiterate that we have come to an estimation that there are about 160 million users of Gmail in United States. Okay.
Okay. Yep.
So now I want to put in the play the fact that we discussed before, like there is difference between usage of enterprise users and usage of consumer, like a
Yep.
normal person. Now thinking deeply about like how would this aggregation go, like not it wouldn't be 50-50. Like out of 160 million I wouldn't expect like 50% of those are enterprise users, because obviously enterprise people are basically people who are working for a company or a firm or an organization which uses Gmail service as their emailing service. So that would be much less, similar to the fact, for example, there might be 10,000 90,000 people working at Google, but number of people who use Google products are a lot more.
Yeah.
So, given with the same assumption based on that calculated risk, I would say about 15% of our current figure would be enterprise user, and rest 85% would be consumers. So
Okay.
that's like a assumption I'm making. Feel free to chime in if you think this might be wrong, or maybe some other assumption might be better to go ahead with.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that split off the top of my head. I agree with your sort of high level logic that the percentage that are enterprise users is going to be a lot less. So I think I'm not going to argue with the particular number you picked there. So let's go with that.
Okay. So just reiterating again, we have two segments here. Segment one is enterprise user, which is 15% of 160 million.
Okay.
And segment two is the normal consumer, which is 85% of 160 million.
Got it. Okay.
So putting that into reference, the 85% would be basically 136 million people,
Mm-hmm.
and the other would be 24 million.
Yep, I'm with you there.
Okay. So now we have these two different figures, and now we have to look into that. If you have a Gmail ID, basically you can use Google Drive as a service.
Yep.
If you're a consumer, you have a limited amount of storage of, I think, 20-25 GB. And if you're an enterprise user, you might have unlimited depending on your admin or your organization.
Yep.
Excuse me. So one thing to think here about is, while I'm estimating, is not every user uses Google Drive. Like just imagine, like if there is a law firm using Google as like their main emailing service, maybe like even the janitor might have a Gmail account, but he might just be using for like looking at his appointments or email or where does he have to go to work next, but may not be using Google Drive
Yep.
or like Google Docs in any way.
Yeah, I think
So
that's a good
now
point.
I think we have to take into account some percentage of depreciation, that out of these many users of Gmail, how many can we estimate would actually use Google Drive?
Yeah.
And then
Okay.
we'll move into Google Docs. So I know this might be a lengthy process, but I think it's a good estimate to make.
Yep.
So out of our current assumption, I would estimate for the enterprise users, that out of 24 million that we have, a ballpark of around 70% would use Google Drive on a
Okay.
weekly basis. So here again, I'm just making an assumption of weekly basis and not daily basis.
Okay. So 70% weekly. Got it.
Yeah, so that would be around 16.8. So I'll just round it off to 17 million.
Okay.
Now, moving on to our second segment, which is the consumers. Here it's very important to know that not all consumers use Google Drive. The fact that enterprise users percentage would be more is because they use Gmail or Google Drive for their work.
Yep.
So there is a good assumption there that these users are people who often use G Suite, spreadsheets, Google Docs, so their percentage would be more. And again, to highlight here that we did include enterprise student accounts. So schools that might be using Google as a mail service. But again, the segment two might have a duplicated account. Like they might have a school account in Outlook, but they might have a personal Gmail account.
Yeah.
So, but the fact here is that lot many consumers wouldn't use Google Drive every day. So that percentage would be less than enterprise. So
Yep.
for enterprise, we went ahead with an estimation of 70%. With normal consumer, I would go ahead with an estimate of about 35 to 40%. And
Okay.
the reason being, many people just use Gmail as a service
Yep.
and not use Google Drive.
Yep. I agree with that. I think that seems fair. So which
Okay.
number do you want to do? Are you using 35 or 40%?
I would go ahead and do 35.
35%.
But
Okay.
I can be wrong. But just to go ahead with this consideration, I would take 35%. So that takes us to around 47.6 million. For the ease of calculation, I'll round it off to 48.
Okay. And this is 35% weekly, correct?
Yeah, weekly.
Okay.
So both figures for segment one, enterprise is 17 million Google Drive users weekly.
Got it. Okay.
And for segment two, it's 48 million Google Drive users weekly.
Okay. Cool.
That is our estimate. Now, the important part here is like how many of these users actually use Google Docs as a service. So I think it's very difficult to estimate the distribution uniformly. Like at any given day, 40% of people would use it. So that's pretty difficult to estimate. But something that might be easier to kind of statistically think about this is a concept of uniform distribution
Okay.
or bell curve.
Okay.
So according to uniform distribution, I think you have to take, if you don't mind, I might want to look up uniform distribution because it has like a certain number associated to it, but it is something that is applicable when you are in a situation where you're not sure what would be the behavior of the given data.
Okay.
So if I quickly look up uniform distribution, okay. So there was a small mistake by me. What I meant was normal distribution and not uniform distribution,
Okay. Got it.
because uniform distribution is what is something that may not work here. Um, is that correct to kind of follow up, or do you think that may not be required here?
So I'm definitely familiar with normal distributions and thinking about those type of bell curves, and I agree that there's going to be a distribution of how these different users use Drive. So trying to apply that that level of detail might not be necessary here. So some sort of proxy could be fine. I'm okay with that. And I think right now where we are, as you've said, right, we have 17 million weekly users of, is it Drive. Was that Drive or Google Docs specifically?
That is Google Drive.
Google Drive. Okay, so 17 million users who use Google Drive and the enterprise, and 48 million consumers that use Drive on a weekly basis. Okay,
Yes.
cool.
Okay. So if we think about Google Drive, what are different functions that we can do in Google Drive? So four of them, which are the most popular one, is create a Google Doc, create
Okay.
a spreadsheet, create a PowerPoint, or maybe use it to store some files or folders.
Okay.
So thinking about both different kind of users we have, I think number one use that Google Drive users do is use Google Drive to store their documents on the cloud. Like I might have some folder, I just create that and save it there. And or almost equal to that is creating a document in G Suite and storing it there. So it
Okay.
might be a collaborative Google Doc or spreadsheet or PowerPoint. Now, thinking about these three uses, I think going with like a user's perspective and considering myself as a user, I
Mm-hmm.
think the most often that we use is Google Doc or the spreadsheet.
Yep.
The reason we use Google Doc is simply because it's collaborative, much like others. But compared to when would you require a PowerPoint, it is basically when you have to show a slide deck or something like that. When would you require a spreadsheet? It is to kind of store a lot of numbers or something like that. But Google Doc is something that you can use for notes, you can just use for anything per se.
Yep.
So pointing out these four things that I mentioned, storing things, Google Doc, slides and sheets, here I would apply the normal distribution which I was talking about, which is like divided into percentages, that is 68, 95, and 99.7. So
Okay.
out of this, I would go ahead with 68% probability that people who use Google Drive would use Google Docs.
Okay.
So rounding off that 68 to 70% for ease of calculation, I would just apply that number to the user base we have. So multiplying each of the numbers we have by 0.7. So
Okay.
that comes to 17 million into 0.7 and 40, that is around 12 million. And our other figure, which is 48 million into 0.7, is around 45.5 million.
Okay. I got the same number. Sounds good.
Yep. So these are weekly active users who might use Google Doc on a weekly basis.
Yep.
Now, obviously, using a Google Doc is very different than creating a Google Doc.
Yep.
And so here I would take a pause and use another approximation to narrow it down, like how many times people might create a Google Doc rather than use it.
Okay.
So I would say that approximation I would like to take is 30-70%. That 30% of the times I might create a new doc, and 70% of the time is I might use something that is already there,
Okay.
which I think is a fair approximation because we often just write in the documents that we have. And compared to that, create a new one rather simply less number of times.
Sure. Yeah, I think that seems reasonable. I could see 30 or 20%, even 10%. Any of those, I think, seem like a fair assumption.
Yep. So going ahead with the same calculation and same numbers, for segment one, we would have around 3.6 million. And for segment two, we would go ahead and have around 13.5 million. So
this is using 30%.
Yeah, using 30%.
Right.
Now there is another segue here that we went ahead and did weekly account.
Yep.
So these are weekly numbers. Now we want to do it kind of daily. So the reason why I didn't add up our both segments from the start, like last 2-3 steps, we are multiplying it by the same numbers, is because for weekly users, enterprise users, week is 5, and for consumers, week might be 5, might be 6, might be 7. So for enterprise users, I'll just divide 3.6 by 5.
Okay.
So doing that, it would give me around 0.72 million per day.
Okay.
And for um, segment 2, I would go ahead and create divide by 6 just for the ease of calculation, because you often work on weekends as well, sometimes as like a normal user or student, but obviously you cannot assume like all days of the week you work. So here I would divide the amount by 6, so
Okay.
that would give 13 point, sorry, 13.5 divided by 6, so that is 2.25. And then if we just go ahead and add both of our numbers, that would give us around 2.97. And to approximately go ahead, I would say, to the answer of the question, it might be around 3 million Google Doc documents created every day.
Okay. Awesome. So 3 million Google Docs created every day in the United States of America. Does that sound, how do you feel about that estimate? Does it feel good? How would you, and like, how would you maybe sanity check or gut check it?
So I think if I have to go ahead and do a gut check for this number, um, I think it might be a little less than the actual number.
Hmm.
And if I have to go ahead where my calculation went wrong, I think it might have been somewhere in the conversion of how many people use Google Drive to Google Docs and how many people use have Gmail account to Google Drive.
Got it. Okay.
Because
Okay.
that's, I think, complex calculation and based a lot on probability, statistics, and behavior psychology. So that's
Yep.
kind of difficult to estimate.
Yep. I agree. It's definitely a difficult estimate. I mean, I think 3 million per day seems certainly like right order of magnitude to me. I mean, I don't know these numbers. They're private to Google, obviously. But if you think about it, you're saying a little less than 1% of all Americans are creating a Google Doc every day. You know,
Yeah.
doesn't sound crazy. Seems like it's in the right ballpark. So good work.
Okay.